Hello, and thank you for listening to my presentation for the paper here at the 5th Online Consciousness Conference, the paper, The Idols of Inner Awareness. My name is Chad Kidd. I'm presenting today from my office in Auburn University in Auburn, Alabama. The paper concerns a debate between two prominent theories of phenomenal consciousness. On the one hand, the higher order representational model, and on the other, the self-representational model. The basic idea of the higher order representational view is, as stated here, that a subject S at a certain time t has an experience with phenomenal character phi, if and only if S has a mental representation of herself as being in a mental state that is phi. Self-representationalism builds on the basic idea of higher order representationalism. To get at these differences, so we see where it adds on, we can read here, a subject S at time t has an experience with phenomenal character phi, if and only if S has a mental representation of herself as being in a mental state M that is phi. S in fact is in a mental state M is phi, and M star and M, aside from standing in the appropriate intentional relation, are also constitutively related to one another. Now, as you can tell from the way I've set up these two theories, I want to pitch the crux of the debate at a relatively high level so that all versions of higher order representationalism and also all versions of self-representationalism will be implicated in the consequences for this argument. As we'll see as the paper proceeds, or as the presentation proceeds, the version of self-representationalism that's at issue is one specific variety of self-representationalism, whereas the consequences against higher order representationalism that I want to present seem to hold for all versions of higher order representationalism. Now, the primary thesis of the paper is that SR is superior to HO because SR can explain the possibility of the epistemic privilege of introspective belief about current and conscious experience, but HO cannot. In other words, SR can provide a positive account for certain key common sense intuitions about the privileged form of epistemic access, whereas HO cannot provide this sort of account. The central argument stems from this idea. The reason that HO cannot account for the epistemic privilege of experience is because it denies that there is a sufficiently robust constitutive connection between the higher order representation and its first order object in the unity of a phenomenally conscious experience. So it is as a result of denying precisely what SR posits that HO fails to be explanatorily adequate. Now, despite this disagreement, there is a significant common ground between SR and HO, and it's important to realize what this common ground is in order not to be led astray into other debates or other worries. Both views, as I understand them, hold to an extrinsic concept of phenomenal consciousness. That is, both conceive of the unity of a phenomenally conscious experience to essentially involve a relational component. The relational component in question is this higher order representational relation, the representation of oneself as being in a first order or world-directed mental state. We can illustrate this by looking at the following diagrams. So on both HO and SR, one is in a phenomenally conscious experience of, for instance, seeing a red tomato. Whenever one stands in the appropriate causal relation to a red tomato, appropriately stimulating one's sensory apparatus, thereby giving rise to a first-order intentional relation to the external world object, here this purple mental state labeled M, and one has the appropriate state of inner awareness, that is, one has the appropriate higher order awareness as of oneself being in the first order mental state M. Here the state of inner awareness is labeled and it is colored gold. It's labeled M star. Thus, both HO and SR employ a certain division of phenomenal labor within their respective theories. They understand the first-order intentional relation to be an aspect of our mental lives that determines what is experienced. And they understand the higher order state, or the state of inner awareness, to determine whether there is experience. Thus, the core of an extrinsic concept of phenomenal consciousness consists in the idea that the key to unlocking the mysteries of phenomenal consciousness reside in untangling these two aspects of intentional relatedness. The first order intentional relatedness determining the what of experience on the one hand, and the higher order intentional relatedness of inner awareness that determines whether there is experience at all on the other. Now, there are a few consequences of the extrinsic concept of phenomenal consciousness as HONSR construe it that are significant here. One is that there's a certain kind of inner-misrepresentation that conscious individuals are subject to, namely the kind that's pictured here, wherein the first-order intentional relation is a veridical representation of its intentional object, but the subject's state of inner awareness misrepresents his first-order mental life. So in this case, the state of inner awareness represents his first-order life as being one wherein the first-order state is a representation, is a visual, say, representation as of a red tomato, instead of what it actually is, a visual representation as of a green tomato. And since this higher order representation determines whether there is an experience, and since the phenomenal quality that is actually produced in this higher order representation is determined by its intentional object, the subject will experience himself as being in a state as of experiencing a red tomato instead of a green one. But the error here, the crucial distinction, is that the error here does not lie in the relation between the first order intentional relation and the external world, but rather totally within the subject's inner life, as it were. And another kind of misrepresentation that has gotten a lot of attention in recent literature is what we can call empty inner awareness. That is, a case wherein a subject is aware of himself as being in a state, say, as of seeing a red tomato, but there is no relevant first-order state there at all. The state is a complete misrepresentation of his first-order mental life. The basic difference is this, that SR understands there to be a constitutive relation between the state of inner awareness and the relevant first-order mental state, and the unity of a phenomenally conscious experience. So, to illustrate, here we have the picture with the distinguishing mark of SR added, namely the constitutive relation between the state of inner awareness and the first-order state that it represents. Well, what is a constitutive relation? What do I mean by this here? Well, I analyze constitutive relations in terms of a simpler concept of one-sided dependence. I use this concept because I think it's easier to get a handle on than supervenience. The idea is generally that X is one-sidedly dependent on Y, if and only if, necessarily. If X exists in W, then Y exists in W. But, possibly, Y exists in W without X. So if we apply this idea of one-sided dependence to self-representationalism, the view that I think is best is one wherein M star, the higher order representational state, is one-sidedly dependent on M. So if M star is realized in the mental life of an individual, then given its one-sided dependence on the object that it represents, M will also exist. However, this is compatible with a case wherein M exists without the higher order state that represents it in the unity of a conscious experience. This seems to me preferable to a dependence SR view wherein the dependencies are spun in different directions, say where the first order intentional state is dependent on the higher order state that represents it in the unity of a conscious experience, because that would make it impossible for there to be such things as unconscious first-order intentional relations to objects. But what about cases of empty inner awareness and other forms of inner misrepresentation? Given that this is a possibility, that follows on the very structure of an extrinsic concept of phenomenal consciousness, self-representationalism, and specifically the version of self-representationalism I prefer, M star to M, one-sided dependence, will need to account for these possibilities. Here, I think, is where where M star to M, one-sided dependence, must go disjunctive. Now, the key elements of a disjunctive view are what I have outlined here. The disjunctive views of perception have gotten a reputation of being somewhat mysterious or difficult to understand. However, the basic ideas of disjunctivism are actually quite simple. So one of the key things that we have to recognize in order for this view to make sense is point number one here, and that's that we have to conceive of states of inner awareness as products of a fallible capacity. So the notion of fallibility is one that applies not directly to states, but rather directly to the capacities that produce or are productive of these states. So to think of a capacity as fallible is, as I have clarified here, to think of it as one that is not successfully executed on every occasion. So there can be successful and unsuccessful executions of the capacity. The second step in a disjunctive view is to analyze the metaphysical structure of the products of successful execution of the capacity for inner awareness, or at least for the SR M star to M one-sided dependence view, is to conceive of the successful execution of the capacity for inner awareness as having that M star to M one-sided dependence structure. Now, I want to call these standard cases of inner awareness for what follows. And the third part of SR going disjunctive is to analyze the products of unsuccessful execution of the capacity for inner awareness as having a significantly different metaphysical structure. Now, it's important to recognize a few key consequences of this view. First, it's important to recognize that a standard state of inner awareness, just like a non-standard state of inner awareness, can both be experiential. So the SR disjunctive view does not deny that for a non-successful execution of the capacity of inner awareness, there is no experience actually produced in the subject. Rather, what it says is that a standard state of inner awareness and experience is a completely different type of state from a non-standard state of inner awareness. Nevertheless, a standard and non-standard case of inner awareness in experience may be, for the subject, indistinguishable from one another. So it's still possible for a subject to be, as I have illustrated here, to be left wondering while undergoing an experience, say as of seeing a red tomato, whether the state of inner awareness that they are in, it's possible for them to wonder whether this state of inner awareness that's constitutive of their experience is one that is a standard state of inner awareness, like what we see represented on the left-hand side, where there's actually a first-order intentional state that the higher-order state is dependent on, or whether it's a kind of state that's represented on the right, that is one that is actually not dependent on anything, but nevertheless is still constitutive of an experience. The key, however, to the disjunctive idea is to conceive of these two kinds of states, these two experiential states, as containing within them states of inner awareness that are of a different, most specific type. So the standard cases of inner awareness are not the same type of state, not possibly the same type of state, as the kinds of inner awareness we have in an empty experience. HO, on the other hand, because it leaves open this possibility that the state of inner awareness in both standard and non-standard cases is the same, is what I will call conjunctivist, right? The key to the disjunctive view is to deny that such ability, that such a possibility, that there is such a possibility. But the key to the conjunctivist view, it seems, is to not deny that there is such a possibility. So the HO is the higher order theory is conjunctivist insofar as it understands the same most specific type of state of inner awareness to be realizable in both standard and non-standard cases, even though the natures of the two conscious states are different, say because one has a corresponding first-order state and the other one lacks one, it's important to notice that the nature of the states of inner awareness within the unity of these two different kinds of states is still the same. Now, higher order theory, I think, is motivated to accept this conjunctivist proposal with regard to states of inner awareness in both standard and non-standard cases, out of a motivation to try to explain how it is that cases of inner misrepresentation can seem the same as cases that don't in any way misrepresent. So the question at this point is, why go with SR and thus also go disjunctive? Why take what seems to be a more indirect route to explaining the indiscernibility of standard and non-standard cases? And here's where one of the key points in the paper arises. What I consider in order to try to motivate the SR view is what Horgan, Teenson, and Graham in a paper published in 2008 call the non-grippingness of internal world skepticism. Now, the non-grippingness of internal world skepticism comes out in a certain asymmetry that obtains between the application of standard Cartesian skeptical thought experiments in one domain and the same application of these considerations in another domain. So the domain where Cartesian skeptical thought experiments are typically most effective is with regard to knowledge of the external world. We consider the possibility here represented in this image that there is an evil demon, here represented by the eye of Sauron, that is usurping the causal relation that we normally have to external world objects. And this renders the first order intentional relation to things in the external world radically false and misleading. However, the thought experiment is supposed to motivate the idea that since we don't have any subjectively discernible criterion by which we can discern, say, the difference between a state wherein we are fooled by an evil demon and a state wherein we are actually seeing a red tomato actually in causal intercourse with the red tomato, then it looks like we can't really ever come to know that we are seeing a red tomato or come to know that we are successfully cognitively related to the external world. Now, the internal world analog of such considerations looks like this. It is for us to consider the possibility not that the evil demon is concerned with, say, usurping the relation that we have to objects in the external world, but rather the evil demon is usurping the relation of inner awareness that we have to our own first order experience. Now, the intuition at this point is that this sort of consideration does not grip us cognitively in the same way that the consideration about external world skepticism considered here does. It's just intuitively this picture does not get a grip. It's much more difficult to get, say, a classroom of intelligent undergraduates to feel the pull of these sorts of considerations than to get them to feel the pull that's related to these sorts of considerations. Right? So typically when we consider that internal world skepticism, we just sit back and think that this is not intuitively very, very convincing at all. Now this I take it to be a phenomenon that needs to be explained by any acceptable theory of phenomenal consciousness. Now notice the explanation here can go in one of two ways. The explanation can be one that in the paper I call a debunking explanation, one that says even though intuitively these internal world thought experiments don't get a grip on us, rationally they should get a grip on us. But I think here that the burden of proof doesn't lie on the side of one who advances a non-debunking explanation, that is, an explanation that actually endorses and tries to explain this non-grippingness of internal world skepticism. Given that there is a successful explanation of the non-grippingness of internal world skepticism, then I think the burden of proof lies on the side of the debunking theorists. It indicates that there are two aspects to the question of epistemological to the question of privileged access. One side of the question concerns a patently epistemological question, and it is, as Horgan and Kriegel in a 2000 paper put it, what is it about knowledge that makes self-consciousness, self-knowledge of phenomenal consciousness so special? And the second is a more metaphysical question. What is it about consciousness that makes knowledge of it so special? I think any full account of this phenomenon of the non-grippingness of internal world skepticism will have to answer both of these questions. Let's look at the patently epistemological question first. I think that there's a really good answer to be found to the patently epistemological side of this question in a view that Alston, in his famous 1971 paper, The Varieties of Privileged Access, calls the true sufficiency analysis. Ram Nida gives a nice summary and also defense of this view in his 2008 paper that I have cited here and in my own paper. But Nida's formulation says S knows in a privileged way that P just if and just when. S knows that P, and S knows this because S believes that P on the basis of the following justification that she has for believing it. P. Now, we can think of some examples that can help illustrate this. So, I know in a privileged way, say, that I feel like I have a headache, just if and just when I know that I feel like I have a headache, and I know this because I believe that I feel like I have a headache on the basis of the following justification, namely that I feel like I have a headache. This seems intuitively clear. It seems a very hard idea to deny, but what's important is that it also seems to yield the right results, and this is what's really important for the analysis. It seems to give the right epistemological import of privileged access concerning phenomenal facts, such as feeling like I have a headache, and what's nice about this is that it shows that what makes these facts privileged, what makes these phenomenal facts privileged, like the epistemic import of them, is that they are their own evidence. They are, as we might put it, self-evident. Now, at this point, the need for the metaphysical aspect, or the metaphysical question, becomes clear, right? The question then urges itself. What is it about consciousness? What is it about this thing that makes it so special, and more particularly what makes it such that it can serve as its own evidence for introspective belief? And here we need an ontological answer, or a metaphysical answer. So we can look at the answer given by SR to this ontological aspect of the question, and their answer is pretty clear. It says that standard cases of inner awareness and experience are factive intentional states. This is something that follows from the claim that states of inner awareness are one-sidedly dependent on their intentional objects. In the cases where the states of inner awareness, that is, where the states of inner awareness are standard cases, then they will be factive. So how things are presented to the subject of a standard experience is how things are with the experience. But how can HO answer this question? Now, it seems to me that HO cannot accommodate a positive account of epistemic privilege. It seems to me if it goes anywhere, it has to give a debunking account. So to see this, let's follow out the following argument here, and this argument is outlined in my own paper on page 12. So the first step in the argument is, according to HO, it is possible for a subject S to be in a state of inner awareness M star, which represents S as being in a state M without S as actually being in M. Now this is just the possibility that follows from HO being a view that it advances an extrinsic conception of phenomenal consciousness. So also we know this is a view that SR, if it's going to be really an extrinsic conception, will also have to accommodate. The trouble, I think, comes in with step 2, wherein M and M star are construed as distinct existences, so that it's possible for the same most specific kind of state of inner awareness M star to exist in both standard and non-standard cases of experience. It follows from step 2 that in step 3, since M star is a common factor of both standard and non-standard cases of inner awareness, it's also possible for S's introspective belief that S herself is in M to be defeated, while S is still experientially aware of herself as being in M. And this is the claim that is denied by the straight epistemic analysis given by the true sufficiency account. So if we think of the true sufficiency account of privileged access as giving us an account that is not metaphysically loaded at all, but is rather something that seems to be an analysis of our intuitive notion of what privileged access consists in, then according to step 3, it already seems that the HO metaphysical account cannot accommodate this purely epistemological side of the story. And this is what I spell out in step 4. Therefore, since 3 contradicts this true sufficiency analysis of epistemic privilege, S's introspective belief about current conscious experience is not epistemically privileged. So how does SR avoid this problem? Well, basically it denies premise 2 and endorses what I have here in orange, premise 5. It says it's impossible for S to be in the same state of inner awareness M star in both standard and non-standard cases. This view is still compatible with step 1, which says that it's possible for subject S to be in a state of inner awareness, which represents herself as being in a state M, without S actually being in that state. 2 lingering words that I discuss in the closing section are this. Doesn't this view, this SR view, fall back into infallibilism about inner awareness? And the second question is, does disjunctive, even that it acknowledges that disjunctive SR marks an ontological distinction, but it denies that this ontological distinction has the epistemological difference that I allege it does. Now, I think worry number 1 is no problem. I don't think it falls back into infallibilism, so long as we keep in mind that the notion of infallibility is one that applies directly to capacities and not directly to states. This leaves it open for the capacity of inner awareness to be fallible in the sense that whenever it does successfully execute its capacity, it brings about what I call a standard state, that is, a state of inner awareness that is one-sidedly dependent. And this production of the one-sidedly dependent state will be the standard by which we measure the successful execution of the capacity, not merely the execution of the capacity simplicator. So let's look at worry number 2. This is the one that I think is really more problematic for the disjunctivist here. But I do think that the disjunctivist can answer it. So the objection is basically this, that since there is no subjectively discernible criterion that distinguishes being in a standard state of inner awareness and being in a non-standard state of inner awareness, how can experience issue the relevant epistemic guarantee for introspection of phenomenal states? If we consider this slide here again, we can see, I can illustrate this a bit more. How is it that you can know? Right? It seems that if there's going to be an epistemic guarantee, one thing we might look for is a subjective criterion that could distinguish the standard case wherein this fellow's state of inner awareness is actually one-sidedly dependent on his first-order intentional states, as opposed to being in the non-standard case. If there's no subjectively evident criterion, then how can I be assured that I'm in a standard case? So there are 2 ways. The way that I try to answer this challenge in the paper is by distinguishing 2 ways of approaching a skeptical challenge. One is called an obstacle overcoming strategy. This is terminology from Qasim Qassam in 2007 book. An obstacle overcoming strategy is one that acknowledges there is an obstacle to knowledge in place, and it attempts to show how we can overcome this obstacle, say by giving either subjectively discernible criteria or by objectively discernible criteria of some sort. But the other approach is one that I think SR must take, or that SR should take, and that's the obstacle dissipating strategy. And this is a strategy that starts from a view of our cognitive capacities that entails the non-existence of the very obstacle on which the skeptical challenge depends. This, I think, is what disjunctive SR does. The evidence of the state is something that is self-evident in the successful cases. So insofar as we can be assured that we do experience successful cases, we can also thereby be assured that we have actually encountered the first-order qualitative structure of our own mental lives. HO can never issue any such guarantee. For them, because the very nature of the higher order representational state is totally distinct from our first order mental lives, there is always this gap that needs to be bridged. And so there's always this internal world skepticism obstacle that needs to be overcome. So thank you very much for your attention and paying attention to this talk. I look forward to a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.